Thank you for hanging on in this afternoon session. We are into the lunch hour, but I think you'll definitely want to hang around for our next two speakers. This will be one of the most hard-hitting, hard-charging panels of the day. We like to wrap up on a very energetic note. I want to introduce two valuable contributors to the American Conservative, two of our regulars. Philip Giraldi is Executive Director of the Council for the National Interest. He is a former CIA officer, and he writes the regular deep background column that appears in every issue of the American Conservative. With him is William S. Lind. William Lind is director of the American Conservative Center for Public Transportation, which is part of the American Conservative umbrella of organizations. He is also the author of the 1985 Maneuver Warfare Handbook, which is still in print and, in fact, is about to be added to with a new edition, a new volume, I should add, on fourth-generation warfare, which will be one of the topics that Bill discusses today. And Bill also is a regular in the pages of the American Conservative. He writes a column on war, basically in every issue of the magazine. Today's panel is going to be about the entity that the progressive journalist Randolph Bourne called the health of the state, namely war. Both of these panelists have views on the state and war which are sort of in the cutting edge. Phil recently wrote a piece for us about what is called the deep state that was picked up by the New York Times, which commented on it. And also Bill Lind has been writing about how the decline of the state, the decline of the conventional state, has led to a new form of warfare, the fourth generation. So I'm going to turn it over to Phil to begin the talk today.
Thank you, Dan. I'm basically going to talk about the deep state and how it impacts on the generation of foreign policy in the United States. This morning we have been hearing a great deal about the shipwreck that is American foreign policy, together with some suggestions about what we might do to fix it. But the question that really begs for an answer is, can it be fixed? In my experience, whenever knowledgeable Americans gather, there is a considerable mystification over the persistence of a foreign policy that appears to serve no real national interests. George Bush declared war on the entire world and is responsible for the worst foreign policy disaster in the history of the United States. Barack Obama wins election with a margin that amounted to a peace vote, takes office, makes some noises about being nice to everyone before adopting the Bush agenda and even doubling down on it. So it is not out of place to suggest that something difficult to discern is working behind the scenes, which led to my consideration of the deep state phenomenon, to explain at least in part why the United States has been engaged in perpetual warfare. I have to admit that I first began thinking of deep state America in a not completely serious way. Having lived and worked in Turkey, I was familiar with derin devlet, as the Turks refer to their peculiar brand of secret government, and actually know some of the players. But as I thought about it more, I realized that while there were significant similarities, there also existed important differences in terms of how the obtaining and holding on to power in the two countries has evolved. Indeed, politics inevitably has little to do with serving the people and everything to do with gaining power and reaping the benefits that come with it. George Orwell put it best when he wrote, "Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes a revolution in order to establish a dictatorship." One must first consider the example of the modern Turkish Republic, a parliamentary democracy complete with a constitution and regular elections that also includes a secret and parallel government. A deep state has to be organized around a center of official and publicly accepted power, which means it normally includes senior officials of the police and intelligence services, as well as the military, all of which are accustomed to operate secretly. The deep state is as old as the Turkish Republic, rooted in the concept that there has to be an outside force restraining dissent and protecting the state. Deep state operates through connivance with some politicians who are able to provide cover for the activity with corporate interest and with criminal groups which can operate across borders and help in the mundane tasks required to finance political corruption. Turkish Prime Minister Tansu Çiller once acknowledged the role of deep state as a hidden arm of government, praising those who died for the state and those who killed for the state, referring to the assassinations of communists and Kurds. There have been several significant exposures of Turkish deep state activities, including one excuse me. I need some water. Including one incident involving an automobile accident that tied together a criminal group that had operated death squads with a senior security official and an elected member of the parliament. A subsequent investigation determined that the police had been using criminals to support their operations against leftist groups. Deep state operatives have also been linked to bombings and assassinations. As all governments, for some good reasons, engage in concealment of their more questionable activities or even resort to out-and-out deception, one must ask how the deep state differs. One has only to read Herodotus to appreciate that politics has frequently been a dirty business, but it is a question of degree. For players in the deep state, there are no accountability and no legal limits, and everything is based on self-interest justified through assertion of patriotism and the national interest. If someone becomes collateral damage as a result, so be it. In Turkey's deep state, associates believe that they are the guardians of the Constitution and the true interests of the nation. In their own minds, they are thereby not bound by the normal rules. Engagement in criminal activity is fine as long as it is done to protect the Turkish people and to covertly address the errors being made by the citizenry, which can easily be led astray by political fads and charismatic leaders. When things go too far in a certain direction, the deep state steps in to correct course. If all this sounds familiar to an American audience, it should. Tansu Çiller's comment praising killing for the state is eerily similar to the public response to accounts of CIA torturers. First of all, one might note that for the deep state to be effective, it must be intimately associated with the development or pre-existence of a national security state, coupled with a perception that the nation is in peril, justifying extraordinary measures undertaken by brave patriots to preserve life and property of the citizenry. Those conditions apply perfectly to contemporary post-9/11 America. The other essential component of the deep state is that the intervening by the ostensibly patriotic elites should work secretly or at least under the radar. Washington is in gridlock, but nevertheless certain things happen seemingly without discussion. Banks are bailed out and corporate interests are increasingly protected by legislation. Huge multi-year defense contracts are approved. Patriot and Military Commissions Acts become law. Citizens are assassinated by drones. The public is routinely surveilled. People are imprisoned without being charged. Military action against rogue regimes is authorized with boots on the ground. And whistleblowers are silenced through invocation of state secrets privilege or punished with prison. The war crimes committed by U.S. troops and contractors, as well as torture and rendition, are rarely investigated, and punishment of any kind is extremely rare. America, the warlike, predatory, capitalist run by special interests, might reasonably be considered a virtual definition of deep state masquerading as a democracy. This all is driven by what has been described as Washington consensus on foreign policy, a post-World War II phenomenon that might be the end result of the interests of the military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower warned about. Earlier, Woodrow Wilson saw the beginning of the end in the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, reportedly lamenting, "We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." In truth, both Eisenhower and Wilson were right. America's deep state is a hybrid creature that operates along a New York to Washington axis. Unlike Turkey, where everyone in the deep state more or less knows each other, the American version is more like a loose confederation that supports common objectives. And unlike the criminal activity that funds the enterprise in Turkey, In the U.S., the banksters, interest groups, lobbyists, and defense contractors operate in the open and ostensibly legally, even though they are subject to little in the way of the rule of law. All the key players in the police and intelligence agencies, the military, the Treasury, and the Justice Departments, and in the judiciary potentially benefit with the glue to hold the system together coming from Wall Street. Financial services might well be considered the epicenter of the entire process. Little dissent comes from the corporate-owned Fourth Estate as the process plays out, while many of the proliferating Washington think tanks that provide deep state intellectual credibility are funded themselves by defense contractors. The cross-fertilization that is essential to make the system work takes place through the famous revolving door, whereby senior government officials enter the private sector at a high level. I might note that the neocons excel at this process. Select individuals are protected, promoted, and groomed along the way, repaying their patrons by arranging for bank bailouts, tax breaks, and resistance to legislation that would regulate Wall Street political donors and lobbyists. The deep state in America is completely corrupt because though it claims to protect the state as well as key private sector institutions, it actually exists to sell out the public interest. And it includes both major political parties as well as government officials. The Clintons leave the White House broke in their own description and accumulate $100 million in a few years. The Pentagon churns out more generals and admirals than the U.S. had in the Second World War. And no one is punished ever. Disgraced former general and CIA Director David Petraeus is now a highly paid partner at the KKK private equity firm in Boston, even though he knows nothing whatsoever about financial services. The deep state wins no matter who is in power by creating bipartisan-supported money pits within the system, monetizing the completely unnecessary and hideously expensive global war on terror benefits the senior government officials, beltway industries, and financial services that feed off it. Because it is essential to keep the money flowing, the deep state persists in promoting policies that make no sense, to include the unwinnable wars currently enjoying marquee status in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. A fearful public goes along for the ride. I think it undeniable that American democracy has been subverted by particular interests hiding behind the mask of patriotism. There exists an unelected, unappointed, and unaccountable presence within the political system that actually manage much of what is taking place from behind the scenes. That would be the American deep state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. Bill?
This city and every capital in the world is completely oblivious to the fact that it is caught up in a change in warfare so great that it not only makes our current defense and foreign policies obsolete, it essentially makes obsolete the whole framework within which we think about defense and foreign policy. And what I want to do today here for a bit is talk about this change in war and its implications for policy. The change is what I call the rise of fourth-generation war, and this is specifically the fourth generation of modern war. Well, what do we mean by modern war? We mean war since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. What Westphalia did was it gave the state a monopoly on war, first in Europe, and then as European influence spread around the globe. The state said, there can be no armed elements fighting out there that are legitimate, that are not forces of the state. If you look at woodcuts of Germany after the Westphalia, you see the trees are festooned with corpses. Those were soldiers who didn't belong to state militaries. To the cheers of the population, what was left of it after the 30 Years' War, state armies went out, rounded them up, and hanged them from the nearest tree. We now think of foreign affairs and defense totally within the framework of the state. State armed forces are designed to fight other state armed forces, but look pretty similar. Uniforms, flags, tanks, aircraft, submarines, what have you. And they fight according to elaborate systems of rules. And again, we heard a bit this morning about jus in bello and so on. It's become, at this point, state-on-state warfare is pretty much a jousting contest. And that's a sign, because when one stage of warfare reaches that point, where the knights essentially are only useful for tournaments, it means those musketeers out there that nobody wants to pay any attention to are becoming kind of important. And that's exactly what's happening today. What we have forgotten because of Westphalia, and because that we have been in the Westphalian system now for 350 years, with foreign policy as well, the State Department thinks solely about dealing with other states, is that before Westphalia, that's not how war worked. Through almost all of human history, war was fought by a wide variety of entities. Families fought wars, Montague and Capulet. Tribes fought wars, clans fought wars, cities fought wars, ethnic groups and races fought wars, cultures fought wars, religions fought lots and lots of wars. Business enterprises, legal and illegal, fought wars. Britain didn't conquer India. India was conquered by the British East India Company, a business enterprise with an army and a fleet. And this was as late as the 18th century, well after Westphalia. The whole system, and again, the whole framework within which we consider defense and foreign policy, is reflective of this fundamental reality. But that reality is changing. What's happening around the world today, in more and more places, is that state armed forces find themselves fighting not other state armed forces, but fourth-generation forces, non-state forces. Groups of fighters who, as in the old days, are fighting for many different kinds of reasons, from impressing the local girls to achieving local salvation, achieving eternal salvation. They represent, once again, clans, tribes, families, business enterprises, races, ethnic groups, religions, the whole old broad-spread basis of war, where there is very little line, if any, between war and crime, is coming back. The pre-Westphalian order is coming back. The Westphalian order is failing. And almost everywhere, when state armed forces meet the physically ridiculously inferior fourth-generation war opponents, they lose. I talk a lot to Marine Corps audiences, and I tell them, you guys are at this point 0-4 against guys in bathrobes and flip-flops armed with rusty AKs, whose resources, if graphed on the same scale as our own, would not be visible. This should be telling you something. It is, by the way, within the Marine Corps now up through the rank of colonel. But headquarters, the brass, they think about nothing but money. This is true of all of our services. Why is this happening? The fundamental reason is the state finds itself in an ever-deepening crisis of legitimacy. And this gets very much to what Phil was talking about with the deep state. The state has become, in more and more countries, including here, and of course the crisis of legitimacy, though it's universal, varies greatly in intensity. And it's not the same here as it is, say, in West Africa. But it's developing everywhere because the state has become the private hunting preserve of what I call the establishment. Again, very much the deep state you're talking about. Everybody knows the Washington establishment here, the two parties that are really one party, the establishment party. The Republican Democrat stuff, the elections, it's all just kabuki for the rubes out in flyover land. The one thing we can be certain of is that the next president will be a member of the establishment, and nothing will change. The public, as it's making very evident here and in Europe, is increasingly anxious for non-establishment alternatives. I can assure you it won't get them. In response to this establishment that has four basic characteristics, first, it can't make things work. If we look at our foreign and defense policy, it is one of serial failure. We go into a place in the Middle East, we wreck the state, destroy the state, no one can rebuild it, we end up fighting in a petri dish of fourth-generation war forces that we have created, we lose, and we go on to do the same thing again somewhere else. The establishment exempts itself from the consequences of its own failures. It wrecks the public schools, but its kids go to private schools. There's no security. The reason the state arose was to provide security for the people who live in much of the city of Washington, D.C., but the establishment lives in gated communities. Third, it cares only about remaining the establishment. What happens to the rest of the society is really of very little concern. Colonel John Boyd, the great American military theorist and reformer, said one of the most important questions everyone faces in life, usually early in life, is do you want to be something or do you want to do something? The establishment is made up almost entirely of people who want to be something. They want to be a member of the establishment, and they have spent decades kissing every ass in creation to get there. Well, they're not about to risk their membership in the establishment. I said to my old boss, Senator Gary Hart, over breakfast in Denver a few years ago, if you're a member of the establishment and you suggest more than 5 degrees rudder change in anything, you instantly cease to be a member of the establishment. And he said, I'm Exhibit A. And then in many countries, including here, including most of Western Europe, there's a fourth element. To be a member of the establishment, you must at least acquiesce to the state ideology. That ideology is what we commonly know as political correctness. It is, in fact, the cultural Marxism of the Frankfurt School. And that ideology's goal, from its initial conception, independently by Gramsci in Italy and Lukács in Hungary in 1919, has been the destruction of Western culture and the Christian religion. So you now have an establishment that cares only about itself, cannot be kicked out, cannot adjust, learn, or adapt, and has its fundamental characteristic, it is at war with the whole heritage of the society and a majority and the beliefs of a majority of its citizens. Now, is there any surprise at this point? We have a legitimacy crisis of the state. And so here, as elsewhere, what people are doing is they are transferring their primary loyalty away from the state, again, to all those other pre-Westphalian causes and loyalties for which people then fought and for which they're fighting again. It's happening here as it's happening all around the world. What does this mean for defense and foreign policy? Well, again, the discussion is almost irrelevant because the establishment will not and cannot change. Some countries in Europe actually have the option of voting the establishment out. They can vote for the National Front in France. They can vote for the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. They can vote for UK Independence Party. And guess what? They're doing so. The real Conservative Party just came in tops in the last election in Switzerland. One of its campaign posters showed 3 white sheep kicking a black sheep over the border. They weren't subtle about it. But we need to know ourselves, as intellectuals, as people interested in this, okay, what should we do to cope with this phenomenon? Well, obviously, the most important thing is reform at home so that we do create legal ways, practical political ways that the public can kick out the establishment and can actually elect a Trump or a Sanders or someone else who really would change things. In defense and foreign policy, almost all the money we're spending on defense, which is about $1 trillion a year, is complete waste. Why? Because A, these forces can't win fourth-generation wars, and the more high-tech stuff they get, the faster they're defeated. B, if we go to war against another state and we win, the other state disintegrates, and we have created yet another region dominated by fourth-generation forces, which will be a far worse problem for us than the state that we went to war against in the first place. Israel, by the way, has created an enormous mess for itself in its neighborhood for precisely this reason. The non-state forces that are now rising all around it in its region, which it did a lot to bring about, are far worse dangers to it than the sclerotic states that they faced before. We need not to be preparing for wars with other states, but to be creating an alliance of all states against non-state forces. War between states is strategically obsolete. No matter what the outcome is, in the end, you lose. So why are we preparing at the cost of $1 trillion a year to fight those kinds of wars? Why are we funding $1 trillion a year for a military that can't and won't even think about fourth-generation warfare because all of its fancy big weapons projects are useless in it? We say we need the F-22 fighter in Afghanistan to shoot down Taliban flying carpets. What we need is an alliance of all states against non-state forces. And instead of our usual cats and dogs collection from the local SPCA of allies, Obama proclaiming, we stand with Romania, we stand with Slovakia, we stand with Ruritania and Graustark. There are only two countries out there that can make a real difference for us, that can do something for us instead of us only doing things for them. Those two, obviously, are Russia and China. So what are we doing today? Our utmost to alienate both Russia and China. Nothing could better illustrate the complete obsolescence, the complete detachment from reality of the cloud cuckoo land, as the Germans say, of this city, than the fact that we are doing our best to get into very serious quarrels with the other two great powers, Russia and China. None of this will change until two things happen. First, the money runs out. Now, the good news here is the money already has run out. Both parties on the Hill are whistling through the graveyard by just borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. We borrow to finance the Democrats' spending programs. We borrow to finance the Republicans' tax cuts and, of course, their worship of the Pentagon. As Paul Ryan has said, we are going to have a debt crisis. And when that hits, and we can't borrow anymore, then the money flow is going to stop. And this vast defense structure we've built that puts out almost nothing in the way of combat power, it's just the grandest middle and upper class welfare scheme ever conceived, that all dries up and blows away because the money isn't there anymore. And at that point, the establishment, including the deep state, are in trouble because they all function on tons and tons of money. They require vast amounts of money. At that point, the second thing becomes possible that we need if we are going to readjust to a world of the decline of the state, and that is we kick the establishment out and we bring in some people who actually are connected with reality. I mean, if we look at Moscow today, why is it that as we play a strong hand poorly, they play a real hand well? Well, Moscow's living in the real world. You know, Putin's pretty much a realist. So are the Chinese. At some point, we either have to kick the establishment out and reestablish policies that are based on reality, or when the establishment goes, it will take the state itself with it here.
Thanks, Bill. So we now have a few minutes for questions and answers. Please do line up at the microphone. We'd like your questions to be in the form of questions, not statements, and try to keep them on the topic of war, the state, and the deep state. Go ahead.
Hi. I had a question regarding you. You made a point about how conservatives tend to be fleeing away from the state. I see a parallel there within a lot of young conservatives who see a lot of potential in the libertarian movement, which is fleeing from the state. So there's a problem that they're fleeing away from the state but don't have anything to flee to. And what do you propose as a solution or any potential for the future for that implication?
Well, libertarianism, of course, flees only to utopia. And it can't do anything else because there is no such thing as a society of completely autonomous individuals. It's a contradiction in terms. Can't exist. What I think we need to flee to is the reformed state made once again legitimate. No conservative wants to see a stateless world, because the first principle of conservatism is order, safety of persons and property. Without that, you can't have anything else. That's what the state arose to bring. And it did so pretty well for a long time. The last thing we want is to go back into something like the interregnum between the fall of the Middle Ages and the rise of the state, Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror, the calamitous 14th century, where you, your family, and your property are continually at the mercy of roaming bands of armed men who take whatever they want from anyone too weak to resist. So the state is central to conservatism. I mean, we are all conservatives are Hobbesians. What we want to do is reform the state so that it is no longer the permanent deep state disconnected from the rest of the society, but is what we had under, dare I say, our Constitution, where it was a small federal government. We had strong subsidiarity. Almost all problems were dealt with at local levels, many not through government. But you had a highly cohesive society with a common culture and a state that could and did maintain order.
Let me amplify or add to some of Bill's comments there. I think that, as Phil had mentioned, this entity, the fact that Americans sort of intuitively are aware that the democratic process, the Republican constitutional order that we're supposed to have, doesn't work as advertised. That, in fact, we have a system of government in which there are, sort of crony capitalist interests that are getting benefits that, people who play fair and play by the rules don't get. It's a system in which privileged players within government as well as business are engaged in self-dealing and don't really apply the rule of law to themselves as they apply to others. So this is one of the things that drives, I think, the rise of libertarianism. It's a correct assessment that there is something deeply wrong with our state. In fact, what's deeply wrong with it is, in large part, the deep state that Phil has described. And Bill is talking about something, reclaiming the state, reclaiming a constitutional order, which is so far outside of the mainstream discussion here in the United States these days that it's something we can hardly even imagine. We think only in terms of electing a person from Party A or a person from Party B, not in terms of the constitutional order and what it requires. And that rediscovering that history and rediscovering those principles may go a long way towards reorienting some libertarians from a kind of very abstract picture that Bill has mentioned, which is based on a stateless world of perhaps free corporations doing what they wish, anarcho-capitalism or what have you, reorienting away from that and reattaching libertarianism and the impulse towards liberty with the state, which originally had been quite closely conjoined. Let me quickly ask Phil a question, because we have someone who has great experience with Turkey here on the stage, and developments in Turkey over the past week with their most recent elections, and in general over the past few months, seem quite sort of interesting and worth probing into. Phil, do you have any sort of insights on what's been happening there and where things are going?
Well, everyone keeps asking me that. Turkey is an extremely complicated culture, and its political culture reflects that. I think the most disturbing thing about Erdogan is the fact that he has taken the Turkish deep state, which was a check on government, and he's making it part of the government. He's making it part of his government. And as part of this, his clampdown on the media in particular is probably the most disturbing aspect. Turkey had a very lively media up until about 2 years ago. And whatever case that Erdogan is making that there are subversive elements in the deep state controlled by a gentleman in Pennsylvania has a certain amount of truth. But the fact is that Erdogan is taking the whole established order, turning it on its head, and creating an autocracy in which he sits at the top. And he's eliminated the checks and balances that were put into the system by Ataturk. Ataturk was the one that basically said the military is the guarantor of the Constitution. And the military in Turkey, when I was there, was extremely secular, and it believed in that. And so now we have a situation where a man who perhaps thinks of himself in terms of being a new sultan is taking steps to bring that about. And it's quite dangerous.
We can see in Turkey, as in elsewhere, as was indicated by the last panel, that there is a shift from political differences, from state differences, towards differences of religion and personal identity and things like that, which is driving us towards a very different kind of world order and tearing down constitutional establishments such as those created by Ataturk, which have been pretty functional and actually pretty prosperous for most of the 20th century. So these are, just huge trends across the globe. Bill talks a great deal about how this is not just a phenomenon in the West, this is not just a phenomenon here or there. It really is the decline of a Westphalian political system which had been dominant for several hundred years and now seems to be perhaps crumbling. So let's go to questions. We have John Walsh is about to ask one.
I enjoyed both presentations a lot. I'd like to direct this question, I think, mainly to Bill Lynn, but to both of you. You talked about the whole scheme coming to an end when the money runs out, when we have the debt crisis or a debt crisis. How do you envision that happening? And do you think that this whole scheme can continue to live on, can persist, if the dollar is replaced by a basket of currencies internationally? It seems almost inevitable now.
Well, I think that, first of all, if the dollar collapses, then the establishment collapses. I think the effects of that on every American would be so profound that, that it would take the establishment down with it. As far as the debt crisis, there's a book, I'm sure most of you know it, of a history of financial crises. This time is different. Well, we're saying again, this time is different. We can continue both as individuals and as a country to live far above the standard of living we could afford on our income by ever greater levels of borrowing. And that somehow this is, because this time is different, this can go on forever. It can't. At a certain point, people start to get uncomfortable about the debt levels, the interest rates demanded start to go up, and you're headed for 1789. Remember what brought about the calling of the Estates General was that it took 50% of the French budget just to pay the interest on the debt. So that's where we're heading. I think I would be surprised if this hasn't started in 5 years.
So let's have the next question.
Hi, my name is Pavel Penev. I'm with the LaRouche Policy Institute. I'll make some claims and I want to see what response you have to them. First, I would say that a part of how the United States became a republic and came out of what you might say the deep state of the British Empire, I think was because you had a effort to educate the population by Benjamin Franklin and other people into a population that knew what it means to have a republic as opposed to live under an empire. So maybe there's a role for that under the current conditions into being able to establish a society that's not governed by a deep state. Another claim I want to make is that deep states are not necessarily limited to the boundaries of a nation. Sometimes they cross them, and national policies could play a part in being able to get other parts of the world out of a control of a deep state. I think policies under Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy had a similar role, for example, in creating conditions where nations that before were mostly used as cheap labor, you might say, became industrialized, and sectors of the population who before that might have been easy to control and manipulate became more powerful. So I also want to see if you have any ideas of how U.S. foreign policy can play a part in that. Like, I think today you have some examples, for example, like the new Silk Road that China is proposing that might have similar effects. So.
Yeah, I think that the effects of those kinds of things on domestic policy are usually not terribly strong. Certainly a major education effort to try to get people to understand what the real problem is here. And again, what are the people telling us at the moment? Look at the support levels for Trump, for Carson, for Sanders. The one thing the public understands about these people is that they are not establishment and that they would bring real change. So we need to inform that resistance, if you will, to the establishment as to why it's right. But the base is already there. I would also be careful about using the term deep state about, say, 18th century Britain. There was no deep state in 18th century Britain. The entire British Empire was run by 45 men from the Horse Guards.
Let me actually ask Phil if he wants to weigh in on the aspect of that question that considered the U.S. in relation to other parts of the world. So during the Cold War, during other parts of our history, we have had interactions which arguably have been beneficial both to them and to us in terms of, maintaining Republican governments. Sometimes in ways that required, all sorts of diplomatic and even non-diplomatic activity. What are your thoughts on the sort of the limits and the benefits and the dangers of American engagement in those forms, especially during like the Cold War?
Yeah, well, I think certainly during the Cold War, and even if one cites the example of Vietnam, there was a certain plausibility to our foreign policy, that essentially it seemed to be driven by national interests. Now, I think there's been an abrupt break in that since 9/11, where we have policies that no longer reflect any genuine interests. And this is becoming quite evident to the public. And I think one of the earlier questions about why young people are drifting into libertarianism and other things like that. Well, young people are not as attached to the political labels that we grew up with, and they can see the hypocrisy in terms of what's occurring. And as a result, this whole edifice is an edifice both in terms of economics and in terms of the perspective of how people see our government, how they see our government interacting with the rest of the world. And it's so evident that something is out of sync. That's why we have candidates arising whose credentials essentially are that they are running against the system. And I don't know, is this a healthy thing? Is it sustainable? I don't really know. And I guess we'll find out in the next year.
Okay, let's go to the next question just to keep things rolling.
I want to make just one quick point about that. And that's, as we point out in my forthcoming Fourth Generation Warfare Handbook, if you're a state military sent in to try to recreate the legitimacy of another state's government, you're a typhoid Mary, okay? What are you going to do to the legitimacy of a government you're coming in to support with foreign troops? It becomes Vichy at that point. And as we see, the quisling armies we create won't fight. And it's the factors against you at the strategic level are so overwhelming that even if you do everything right, you are almost certain to lose. So when you hear politicians say, well, should we put boots on the ground in X country or Y country? The real question is, should we put boots on the ground and lose again in X country or Y country?
Okay, we have time for one more question. So yes,
if I may, I'd like to address the last panel. I would like to say if we could get into the deep Bible and read more about Cyrus and the role of Zoroaster in the Old Testament. That's to that panel. To this panel, I would like to ask Dr. Giraldi, what happened to Erdogan? We were delighted, we were euphoric when Brazil, Turkey, and Iran formed an agreement which Hillary Clinton squashed. And we were delighted with Davutoglu's zero enemies policy. What happened? What changed?
Well, Erdogan began to believe his own press releases. He's like politicians in the United States. You have to ask yourself, what drives a politician? What drives somebody who wants to become a head of state and wants to reshape how his country is functioning? That's essentially what Erdogan is. He sees himself as a revolutionary figure. He's restoring Islam to its proper place among the Turks. He's doing a number of other things. He was the darling of the West for a long time because he favored free markets, and he appeared to be someone that Western leaders could work with. And this is a classic error on the part of U.S. and European foreign policy. We always want somebody that's familiar, somebody that looks comfortable. For example, in Afghanistan, the people who rose to the top after our invasion of the country were essentially people who spoke English. This happens again and again and again. It's the wrong way to be running a foreign policy. It's the wrong way to be doing anything.
Okay, well, that wraps up the time we have for questions and answers. Bill, Phil, do either of you have any sort of last parting shots you'd like to fire?
Well, I think Bill hinted at this, and I tried to mention it too. The money is what drives all this. It's all about money. Elites in the United States essentially have become dominant because of their control of the system, which gives them lots and lots of money. And when the money runs out, Bill made the point that that's the end of the show.
It's so hard to grasp that the real threat of fourth-generation war is not, the fact that we're losing in the Hindu Kush. It's what happens on our own soil, because fourth-generation war does come to a theater near you, whether you want it to or not. That I wrote it up as a novel, because you paint a picture by writing a novel. And if you're interested in this, you may want to take a look at it. It's titled Victoria, a novel of fourth-generation war. It is under the pen name of Thomas Hobbes because it is an update of Leviathan. And it is set 50 years in the future here. And it is not just the country breaking up in 4GW. It is also, in part of the country, the Northeast, the recovery of the old culture, which calls itself Victoria. It's returned to the Victorian age because it works.
Bill, let me ask you right fast. When does your book on fourth-generation warfare come out?
That will be out, Fourth-Generation Warfare Handbook by myself and Lieutenant Colonel Greg Thiel, U.S. Marine Corps, be out as an ebook probably by the end of November. It's Castalia House Press, and it should be out as a real book early next year. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, both to Phil Giraldi and to Bill Lind. We're now wrapping up our conference. Thank you all very much for attending. I'd like to thank the George Washington University Political Science Department for co-sponsoring this, as well as the Charles Koch Institute, and also the Plow Publishing, which has been one of our gold sponsors and was also very helpful. We hope to continue this conversation in many formats, both in the print American Conservative magazine, also on our website, theamericanconservative.com, and also through interactive media such as Blogging Heads, which is a series of video dialogues, debates over various issues. And we've interacted with them before, and we will continue to have a series of foreign policy discussions through video outlets such as Blogging Heads. With that, I think we can conclude, and enjoy your lunch.